The tragedy of Bahamut is one of man and dragon, spanning thousands of years. But our story starts not all too far in the past. It was in the waning days of the 6th Astral Era. Eorzea stood at the precipice of disaster. The Garlean Empire had amassed a powerful army, seeking to fully conquer her lands. Led by the 14th and 7th Legion, and the respective legati, Gaius van Baelsar, the Black Wolf, and the White Raven, Nael van Darnus. Struggling to contend with the heroes of Eorzea and the primals of the beast tribes, Nael and the 7th Legion envisioned a radical solution to their wayward subjects in waiting. Project Meteor, a plan requiring lost knowledge of ancient Allag, was devised in order for Garlemald to pull Hydaelyn's lesser moon, Dalamud, down from the heavens, crashing it into Eorzea, from which the Garleans then might rule and rebuild from its ashes. In these same days, the archon Louisoix arrived in Eorzea, convinced of dire portents that hearkened to the 7th umbral calamity. He was determined to help save the realm, despite the opposition of his native Sharlayan and the protestations of his son. Discovering that Dalamud was in fact no moon, but a space prison designed as a celestial cell for a primal, Nael and the 7th Legion created a mechanism by which it might be contacted, creating a castrum from which Nael might transmit to the moon in order to call down Dalamud. The Grand Companies of Eorzea put aside their differences and gathered their forces to assault and destroy the outpost. Though they succeeded, the White Raven took flight, and atop a formation of rocks above Kurthis, initiated the final activation signal, which reached out to the artificial moon, and began the chain reaction that would bring about Dalamud's final descent. Clearly gone mad and chanting both to Dalamud and what lay within, Nael was defeated by a group of heroes, and his body's aether was drawn into the lesser moon. His defeat, however, was too late to halt the inevitable impact. Louisoix, seeing the 7th umbral calamity was doomed to come to pass, began a desperate plan in order to halt the moon's descent. He would travel Eorzea, bidding its people have faith in the 12, that their belief might prove succor for his aims. The moon ever approaching, despite the defeat of their leader and the oncoming apocalypse, the soldiers of the 7th Legion were ordered and proceeded to gather and assault the heart of Eorzea at the flats of Cartnau. The Grand Companies of Eorzea, forced to defend themselves, met them in battle as the red moon hung ever lower, and shards of it proceeded to break apart and rain hellfire upon Eorzea. Meeting with unmatched ferocity, the heroes on both sides stood, fought, and fell in droves. It was all for naught, however. Victory or defeat, regardless, the red moon descended, eventually breaking apart to reveal the elder primal Bahamut, finally free of his ancient prison after 5,000 years of confinement and torture by Allag. Friend and foe fled as one in that moment, and as Bahamut swept across the land, blasting it with fire and darkness, despair gripped the realm, as the 7th umbral calamity began. Even amidst the darkness, a light broke free. Louisoix's plan was initiated, a primal summoning of the 12, based in the aether of the realm and the prayers of all the people of Eorzea, who wished for one thing: salvation. The plan seemed like it would work, as the primal was brought forth and began to seal Bahamut. It was not enough. Bahamut broke free of his fetters, and as the elder primal stood drenched in shadow and flame, prepared to cast its most mighty spell to end the land, Louisoix, with the last of his strength, cast magics of Ulthic, throwing those heroes still left upon the battlefield into an ethereal rift, where they might be frozen in time until it was safe to return to a realm reborn. In a flash of light, a lone hero returned to the world 5 years later, only to discover that the realm had survived Bahamut's assault, and that the Elder Primal had mysteriously disappeared, with no one sure how it had been halted or defeated. What's more, Louisoix was missing and presumed dead, and the people of the realm suffered only hazy recollections of those events at Cartnau. Even those brave heroes who stood upon the field as Bahamut made ready to end the realm were little more than blurry shadows in the memory of the people. Beyond this, the seventh umbral calamity had marred the realm with astrally polarized aether, resulting in large shards of corrupted orange crystals. The hero who returned, known to us as the Warrior of Light, aided the grand companies of Eorzea in defeating the lingering darkness of the realm, and bringing about the end of the seventh umbral era, and the rise of the seventh astral era. It is at this dawn where our story begins, as the echoes of the past ring out. In the early days of the seventh astral era, the Warrior of Light went about contending with primal threats of the land. Having faced down the primals summoned by the beast tribes once more, they were left to contend with a looming presence. Eorzean informed them that as they slew primals, another presence, the same one that had roared at the dawn of the seventh astral era, was growing ever stronger. As if the slaying of the primals and the subsequent release of aether was feeding it. As grave as this seemed, there was hope, as the second of the Levior twins had offered her aid. Alice, sister to Alphino, was to act as the Warrior of Light's companion in their investigations. Meeting her in Louisoix, she reintroduced herself, as it had been quite some time since the two had first and last met. Going over their current information, she reiterated the events of Cartnau and Dalamud's fall, explaining that the calamity had affected the very etheric channels of Eorzea, creating irregular pools of aether and forming subterranean tunnels all throughout Eorzea's underground. One of these caverns lay below Castrum Occidens in eastern Louisoix, following the etheric fluctuations that had alerted Eorzean in the first place. They began their descent. Alice further explaining along the way her grandfather Louisoix's role 5 years prior, his mysterious vanishing, and her deep desire for closure on the matter. Descending hundreds of yalms underground, they were greeted by a sea of corrupted aether crystals. An inordinate amount of aether being required in their formation, there must have been a source. Knowing of Dalamud's history, and presuming Garlemald's desire to investigate the remnants of the mechanical moon that had sunk into the earth, they pressed on, only to discover the defense systems of Dalamud were yet active, and they would have to fight their way through. Finding their way through a maze of crystal tunnels and remnants of Allagan technology, they eventually came to an open part of the cavern. The two witnessed the wing of Bahamut, half made of the very crystal that surrounded it. Proof that the dread worm had in fact been defeated. But if the primal had been slain, then why was his physical form not dissipating, like that of other primals? With their first clue as to Louisoix's fate, but now holding many more questions, the two ventured ever deeper, as an enigmatic figure watched. Traveling down, first 1,000, then 2,000 yalms deep, they fought their way past all manner of twisted creations of Allag, arriving upon a landing, which to Alice's shock, turned out to be the outstretched talons that was once the hand of Bahamut. After the sudden shock, a question lingered. If his form was still corporeal, then the aether of Bahamut had not returned to the land, and thus, what had caused Eorzea's resurrection in the first place? Before much consideration could be afforded, the two were beset by dragons of Mericidia, collared in Allagan artifacts known as neural links, which allowed for their enslavement. Besting the dragons, and arriving inside a large shard of Dalamud, Alice sought to activate its mechanism in the hopes of furthering progress. As it awoke, it opened to show the decapitated head of Bahamut, with a crystalline heart of darkness pulsating with life. It was being stimulated by pylons, 3 that surrounded it, with the 4th being the one upon which Alice and the Warrior of Light stood, though it seemed no longer active, having been shut off by Alice's tinkering. These pylons, known as internment hulks, were the very binding coils of Bahamut themselves. Distressed at the revelation that Louisoix's sacrifice had been for naught, Alice resolved to retreat, until she saw the shade of 2 figures from afar, one of which seemed to be Louisoix. Begging for him not to leave, Alice watched the figures vanish, and so she and the Warrior of Light fled. Using an ethereal exit out of the binding coil that transported them above ground, the duo found themselves not in Louisoix, but in northern Hydaelyn, many malms away from their starting point. It seemed the tunnels that housed Bahamut's broken form ran throughout Eorzea, a giant spiderweb with Bahamut's heart located beneath Cartnow. Unsure of their next move, but resolved to defeat Bahamut and discover why her grandfather would not return to them, Alisaie returned to Eorzean to prepare for her next course of action. Discussing the revelations discovered beneath the ground, Eorzean surmised that Bahamut itself was draining the land of its aether and regenerating, slowly beginning to stir. The binding coils were in fact not only a method of containment, keeping Bahamut in a kind of stasis, but also saw that the Elder Primal was unable to die and forcibly sustained. Even after his prison had broken apart and Bahamut was defeated, the binding coils were acting to maintain and restore his form, as they had done for 5,000 years inside of Dalamud. Knowing what his resurrection would mean for the realm, Alisaie and the Warrior of Light prepared to shut off all 3 of the remaining coils, and thus remove that which kept Bahamut alive, readying to once more brave the depths of Eorzea. The entrance to the second binding coil of Bahamut was located in the northern region of the Black Shroud. Its ingress, a massive shard of Dalamud that stood grim over the Twelveswood. Before arriving, however, the Warrior of Light was pulled aside by Alphino Levier, who spoke of his concern for his sister. Not for her physical safety, as she was more than capable of handling herself, but for her reasons behind fighting. She seemed more focused on saving her grandfather than the realm he sought to protect. Alphino implored the Warrior of Light help her to discover a better reason to fight for the salvation of Eorzea before taking his leave. Upon arrival, Alisaie and the Warrior of Light braved their way towards the Shard of Dalamud, the air around it humming with corrupted crystals and aether. Fighting their way through corrupted flora and fauna and arriving at the entrance of the structure, they found themselves face to face with a ghost of the past. Nael van Darnus, the White Raven, stood clad in their armor, looking the same as that fateful day above Kurthus. Alisaie, calling out to them, elicited confusion, as if the name was unfamiliar. Uncertain how Nael had survived, but sure of their tempering, Alisaie and the Warrior of Light resolved to contend with this threat. But Nael merely offered a warning to go no further, and retreated. Giving chase for yalm after yalm deep into the Allagan construct, facing mechanical and etherochemical malcreations, the two eventually arrived in a chamber that appeared as if an exact recreation of that final battle against the White Raven 5 years prior, with Dalamud hanging low on the horizon. Finding the shade of Nael there, who proclaimed it to be a holy sanctuary of Bahamut, Nael, attempting to summon forth the Primal's power, began to glow. Alisaie struck out with her magic, removing Nael's helmet with a single spell, and revealing not a man as assumed, but a woman beneath. Claiming to be an amalgam of memory and soul, born from the remnants of Nael van Darnus, absorbed by Bahamut, the being transformed into a draconic demon, and a pitched battle ensued. Though a struggle, the Warrior of Light struck a mortal blow, and as Nael fell to the ground in defeat, the projection of the simulated battlefield faded away, seeming to only be an Allagan illusion. As Nael stood there, her form fading away, her old self seemed to return, relinquished from Bahamut's control in her final moments. Memories of the past and anger at becoming a pawn of the very primals she sought to destroy filled her. Alisaie begged for more insight on the fate of her grandfather, but had her pleas fall on deaf ears. Nael merely imploring her to march on and steel herself for what lay ahead if she'd have her answers. A piercing light broke the silence, and its beam shot through Nael's chest as a familiar voice boomed out, commanding her to cease her chattering. Nael, now free and fading, was of no further use to Bahamut, and so was forevermore silenced. Seeking the source of the light and voice, Alisaie and the Warrior of Light rested upon the second coil, and the frame of Bahamut, now half restored to its original form. Giving voice to her resolve to save the realm, Alisaie shut off the second binding coil, leaving only 2 left to deactivate. As the duo began to withdraw, a surge of energy blasted Alisaie aside. Louisoix, standing before them, demanded Alisaie cease her quest to prevent Bahamut's revival. Displaying nothing but contempt for his once beloved granddaughter, Alisaie was left confused and broken-hearted as Louisoix revealed the truth of his tempering, disappearing with one final warning. Determined to free her grandfather's soul, Louisoix swore vengeance at the slumbering remnants of Bahamut before retreating from his hollow. Returning to the surface, the two scions began their search for a final entry point to the remaining binding coils. Searching various other shards of Dalamud across Eorzea resulted in little success, until a method was devised to reverse engineer the ethereal currents used for egress from the prior two coils, to travel down rather than up. An ingenious plan developed by Alphino Levieur, much to Louisoix's chagrin. Posing a question to Louisoix, Alphino questioned not her resolve to defeat Bahamut, but from where the resolve came. Were her actions for the sake of Eorzea merely a borrowed dream from their grandfather? With the question posed, Alphino stated his intent to join the team for their final foray into Bahamut's den. Teleporting into the first of the two binding coils, the trio were greeted by a sight of the now familiar Allagan mechanisms, and a sea of pods, containing all manner of Allagan chimeric creations. Questioning once again from where Bahamut was drawing the requisite faith and prayer to sustain its form, Louisoix and co pressed onwards, battling their way into a chamber housing row after row of tubes, containing Mericidian dragons. Coming to the realization that Allagan was keeping them in a perpetual state of waking slumber and enslaved using neural links, the dragons were a horrifying sight. Louisoix relented that they and Bahamut were to be pitied rather than loathed, and the actions of ancient Allagan were not only immoral and cruel, but shone a spotlight on the failings of mankind. Despite this, Louisoix's resolve was unbroken, as regardless of the sins of the past, Bahamut represented a terrible fate for all those of the here and now, regardless of their race or creed. Further in did they witness a representation of Dalamud envisioned from within, and the sight Bahamut must have stared at unblinking for thousands of years, his hatred and fury building with each passing moon. Once again, the twins were reminded of the tragic history that Dalamud represented. Breaking through into the precipice of the third binding coil, the three scions witnessed Bahamut near completion in his physical form. Without hesitation, they sought to disengage the third coil, but as they approached the console, they were stopped by the tempered shade of Louisoix. Refuting that the tempered shade spoke for the person her grandfather was and standing in the face of his scorn, the twins refused to back down. In retort, the tempered Louisoix told them of the history of Bahamut and Mericidia. 5 millennia ago, in the twilight years of the Third Astral Era, the Allagan Empire went to war with the world in order to conquer it. Its most bitter fight was with those of Mericidia, led by the dragons Tiamat and her beloved Bahamut. Though they fought with all their might, Bahamut was slain, and in her grief and desperate for salvation, Tiamat and her brood summoned forth Bahamut as a primal. Only, this primal form was a cruel and pale shade of the dragon she had loved, and though it sought to wreak devastation upon Allagan, this merely played into their plans, as they captured the primal Bahamut and placed him into the core of their new false moon, Dalamud. Using him as a living heart, from which the moon might send the energy of the stars from the heavens down to the earth and into their crown jewel of the Crystal Tower. The tempered Louisoix called into question the difference between the dragon's desire for salvation and Eorzea's plea for such at Cartnau, and what distinction might be drawn between the two. Standing as a bastion for her grandfather's legacy, Louisoix fought back with her faith in the strength of mankind to stand together. Louisoix's mocking response dismissed her faith and belief, calling into question how man could even agree on which direction to stand. Interjecting and tiring of his grandsire's use as a puppet for Bahamut's words, Alphino posed the question whether or not the Shade held such scorn because he was a thrall of Bahamut, or because he was now in fact a primal. Revealing his true form at last, Louisoix changed into the immortal phoenix, a symbol of rebirth, stating that if they sought answers, they would have to claim them. A battle for truth began. Putting deed to words, the phoenix fell, and the light of Louisoix was at last free. Appearing before his grandchildren in his last moments, with his sanity fully restored, Louisoix imparted to them how proud he was and the truth of what happened that day at Cartnau. As Garleans and Eorzeans fought under the falling moon, and Bahamut awakened, all seemed lost. But as Louisoix activated his plan to summon a primal of the 12, and it began to seal away Bahamut, there was a spark of hope. Alas, Bahamut's rage and power was too great, and it broke the shackles of the 12, destroying their primal facsimile. With Bahamut preparing to obliterate the continent, Louisoix cast the Warrior of Light into the future with all he had left, preparing to meet his end. However, it was not to be, as the aether that had been spent to summon the 12, now drifting above the Cartnau Flats, mixed once again with the prayers of Eorzea and Louisoix's own conviction to bring salvation to her people. Infusing him with the power of a primal, it transformed him into the Phoenix, a symbol of salvation and renewal. Using all of his might, Louisoix struck one final blow through Bahamut, fracturing the Elder Primal's form. Louisoix then relinquished his hold over the gift given to him, and much of their combined aether rained down upon the land, beginning its restoration. But Bahamut still lingered through hate and rage, and drew the last of Louisoix's soul and aether into himself, taking hold of him as one of his thralls. What remained of Bahamut crashed into the ground and fell deep beneath Cartnau, still holding on to his and the aether of the Phoenix, preventing the land from fully restoring itself. Though Dalamud was a wreckage, the binding coil still functioned, and the housed dragons of Mericidia still proffering their faith. The structures sought out their charge, burrowing their way underground so they might continue to maintain the Elder Primal. Imploring the Warrior of Light to finish the fight and end Bahamut once and for all, Louisoix shut off the third binding coil and prepared a portal to the final coil for the three to use. Turning one last time to his grandchildren, Louisoix imparted onto them the need for their hopes and dreams to be their own, and not an extension of his. Proud of the people they had become, he spoke of his belief in their conviction, and as a final gift, he imparted the remaining aether of the Phoenix to his grandchildren, that they might ever walk in the light. As he faded away, Alice, Alphino, and the Warrior of Light prepared to enter the portal and end Bahamut once and for all. Preparing to shut off the final binding coil, Bahamut roared and fired a mega flare, nearly ending the party. Preparing a second volley, Alice and Alphino stood together, a bastion of faith and resolution against the dragon's darkness, using the very tomes their grandfather had given them on the day he left for Eorzea. They formed a shield made of their magics and their grandfather's aether to stave off Bahamut's attack. Buying enough time for one final act, they knew that shutting off the final coil would not be enough, and sent the Warrior of Light deep into the very ethereal heart of Bahamut, where they would fight the Primal incarnate. Through a sea of flame and rage, dragons of Mericidia and Allagan synthetics, the Warrior of Light prevailed, weakening Bahamut enough that as the final coil was shut off, the Elder Primal's form began to dissipate, his aether returning to the land, and all was still. Taking a moment to rest, the twins wondered over their next course of action. Should the truth of the Phoenix become known, it would only draw people to its story of salvation, and all too likely result in the people of Eorzea attempting to summon the Primal. If parties such as Garlemald or Ishgard learned of the Allagan technologies and ability to enslave, they would seek endlessly for that power. They decided to consign the truth of Bahamut, their grandfather, and the events that day at Cartnau to be forgotten, that the realm might be able to move on to a brighter future. For the final time, the party ascended back above ground, weary and battered, but alive. The twins said their goodbyes, Alphino and Alice going their separate ways, both with their own paths to walk. Sometime later, Alice and the Warrior of Light met at the Burning Wall in Hydaelyn, one of the vestiges of Dalamud's fall. Alice professed her hope for a better future for this realm reborn, and offered a flower in the memory of those who had passed. Promising that when next they met, she would have a tale or two to tell, Alice left the Warrior of Light's side, the two not knowing when their paths might next cross. The story of the binding coils of Bahamut is a window into the events of the calamity and the time before a realm reborn. But even more than that are its truths on the ancient tragedies of this star, the crimes of Allag, the pain of the dragons, and the threat of primals. And though this story is but one chapter in the Warrior of Light's tale, it is one which affirms all for which they stand. This content was brought to you by the Eorzean Archives. If you enjoyed this video, help us please the 12 by leaving a like and subscribing for new content every Thursday, and comment down below with any topic you'd like to see our archons cover in the future. For even more content, discussion, and exclusives, please check out our Discord and consider supporting us on Patreon.